a bit of an outline of my talk. I'm going to give some introduction and background about what the EoR is and what science we're trying to accomplish. Then I'll talk about the hardware and the instruments that we use to do this science. Next, I'll get a little deeper into my own research, talking about how we plan to achieve this science and what my work is achieving precision calibration techniques. And this is kind of divided into two main branches. The first one is improving the calibration sky model, and the second one is improving calibration techniques themselves from kind of a more fundamental standpoint. And then finally, I'll talk about doing all of this work with the cloud. So we do a lot of our computation in the cloud, which is exciting and interesting. And I'm gonna give a little overview of how we do that. Yeah, so just starting off, some introduction and background. So I like to start off with a cartoon of the evolution of the universe with the Big Bang and inflation on the left. Next is recombination and the emission of the CMB, the surface of last scatter. Following that is the dark ages, which are called that because there were no luminous objects in the universe. After that is the Epoch of Reionization, or EoR, and that brings us to the present day. So the CMB has been really extensively studied and continues to be extensively studied. You've probably all seen this work coming out of the Planck collaboration that maps small temperature fluctuations in the CMB. And this has given us just an incredible wealth of information about the evolution of the universe, about the primordial universe. It constrained cosmological models, gives us an understanding of Big Bang cosmology. So it's just been all around a really incredible science result. My work is trying to take a lot of the techniques and the lessons learned from the CMB community and do much the same thing for a different cosmological phase transition, this EoR phase transition. So what is the EoR? It's an extended phase transition. So unlike the CMB, which happened very quickly, this happened over a long period of time. And it is talking about the period of time when the first galaxies and black holes ionized the intergalactic medium, or the IGM. So radiation from these first luminous objects propagated out in the IGM and ionized it. So this led to this massive phase transition from the IGM being almost completely neutral to being almost completely ionized. And when I talk about ionization, I'm really talking about the ionization of hydrogen. So there are other elements in the IGM, trace amounts, stuff like helium, that also ionized at a slightly different period, but we're really interested in this hydrogen reionization. All right, so this is a simulation of a model of what the EoR might have looked like. So here, these bright spots that we see are regions of ionized hydrogen. They have luminous sources in them, and the radiation from those luminous sources is propagating out and ionizing the IGM. And you can see that as this progresses, these bubbles of ionized hydrogen become larger and start to coalesce. And then at the end of this simulation, you'll see that the IGM is completely ionized, and we just see those sources within the ionized IGM. Just wait for this to finish. Right, so this is kind of the state of the modern universe. Oops. There we go. So why are we interested in the EoR specifically? Well, first of all, it's currently very unconstrained. We don't actually know when it happened, and we don't know how it happened and what were the types of sources driving this phase transition. If we were to make a direct measurement of the EoR, it would give us the density, the temperature, and the ionization fraction during this phase transition, which would be extremely important for revealing the dynamics of early galaxy formation, telling us what sort of galaxies were these early galaxies, what sort of black holes they were, what was driving reionization. It would also test cosmological models of dark matter and dark energy, which would be very important for constraining the evolution of the universe. So the key to actually making this detection of the EOR is the hyperfine splitting of neutral hydrogen. So this is an energy transition that emits at 21 centimeters, and it has to do with the relative alignments of the spin of the nucleus and the electron in the hydrogen atom. 21 centimeter cosmology is kind of an umbrella term for the process of using this 21 centimeter emission line to do cosmology. So we can use it to measure large scale structure, things like the EoR, high redshift. And yeah, so when I talk about 21 centimeter cosmology, it's really all of these different fields that are all leveraging this 21 centimeter emission line to learn how the universe formed. We call this a forbidden transition line, which just means that quantum mechanically, it's very rare that this transition happens. And this actually works to our advantage because it produces a very narrow emission line. And that means we can precisely map it to redshift. And so if we were able to make a high confidence detection of the signal, we could generate a movie of the EOR and basically recreate that simulation I just showed, which would be really neat. So yeah, we could produce a 3D map where we have a redshift axis and we can basically see the evolution of the EOR. Because this is at high redshift, we expect that the EOR happened around a redshift of 7, but again, it's not well constrained. We expect to observe this 21 centimeter emission at a wavelength of 1 to 2 meters. All right, so where is the current state of the field? We're in a regime right now where we have not yet detected the signal, but we are establishing progressively better upper limits on the signal. As our precision improves, we can drive those upper limits down and get more sensitive measurements of the EOR. So this plot here is showing a lot of the recent limits that came out in the field. The bolded ones on the bottom are ones that I co-authored. And you can see, if you pay attention to the dates, in the last decade, there's kind of been a progression of these limits getting lower and lower. On the other hand, the dotted black line you see here is a fiducial EOR model. So this is a good guess of what the EOR level might be. I should say that these are power spectrum measurements. So everything we're doing here is on the power spectrum. It's a statistical measurement. Yeah, so we are a couple orders of magnitude away from this fiducial EOR model right now. The shaded gray region is just kind of a rough estimate of where all of the theoretical models lie. So like I said before, the EOR is not well constrained. There's a multitude of different theoretical models and they kind of span this entire shaded gray region. So what's really exciting is that if we can achieve another order of magnitude in our limits, we'll start ruling out plausible models of the EOR. And that's when we're really doing real science, which would be extremely exciting. Current limits are systematic limited, which means that they will not improve with more data. So all of these limits are developed with long integrations of a lot of data. But adding more data at this point will not help because we have other systematics, non-thermal systematics going on in the data that we need to be able to mitigate in order to improve our limits. So that's kind of where my work comes in. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the instrumentation that we use. I should say that there's a lot of different instruments, a lot of collaborations working on EOR science. I'm going to talk about just 2 of them because these are the 2 collaborations that I work with. So first of all is the Murchison Widefield Array, or the MWA in Western Australia. It consists of these tiles with 16 dual polarization dipoles each. And the tiles kind of work together as a single antenna or station where we just combine all of the measurements from the 16 dipoles. And like I said before, this is in the outback of Western Australia. It's about an 11-hour drive by Jeep over dirt roads from Perth. So to give you a sense of scale, these are just some real life humans on one of these tiles. So I'm second from the right here. This was on one of the commissioning trips that we did for the phase 2 upgrade to the telescope, where we added some extra tiles. So one neat thing about this configuration of these 16 dipoles on a tile is that we can make the telescope electronically steerable in this way. So we can add a delay to some of the dipoles And that allows us to point to different parts of the sky without any mechanically moving parts. This is just some drone footage of the core of the array. This is kind of just give a sense that this is an enormous array. And not captured here is the fact that it spans 5 kilometers. So it's absolutely huge, spread out over the outback.
Sorry, can I ask, how do you guys determine, like, because I saw these cluster of detectors, like how do you guys like determine where to put one cluster and like their relative position to each other?
Yeah, that's a good question. Hang on, let me advance the slide here. It's not letting me advance. Sorry. Yeah, so about antenna placement. There, can you all see that again?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later. The MW is predominantly what we call a pseudo-random array. And so the antenna or the tile placements are chosen to maximize the number of modes that we're measuring on the sky, which is a little bit different than some other arrays that are trying to maximize sensitivity of a single mode, for example. One thing that is unique about the phase 2 upgrade is that we added some non-random elements. And so that gives us extra sensitivity and allows for different types of calibration. But on the whole, it's pseudo-random. And that means that it's trying to get a large variety of different baselines that we measure. Does that answer your question?
Yes. All right, thank you.
All right, so the other collaboration that I work with is called the Hydrogen EoR Array, or HERA. This one is located in the South African Karoo, and it consists of these large dishes and a close packed array configuration. So again, for scale, these are some members of the site crew next to one of these dishes. So you can see that they're quite large. The feed that you see here suspended is actually an old style of feed. And we've since replaced all of these with a new feed. So this is a picture of one of those with my collaborator, Pixie Star here. You can see that these feeds, they're called Vivaldi feeds, and they're about human sized. And we suspend them over the dishes. So this is a picture of me at the HERA site. We use these contraptions to raise and lower the feeds. So I couldn't help but put this comic in just to express that these are radio interferometers, which means that there are these large arrays and they all work together to make an image of the sky. And when I was first learning about radio interferometry, I heard this explained to me as you get the performance of a much bigger telescope by stringing together these different antennas. Now that's not strictly true, but the important part is that we're using pairs of antennas to make our measurement and correlating them together. So this is just a representation of the fact that our fundamental data unit is this correlation between the measurements of 2 different antennas, and we call that a visibility. You'll also hear me talk about baselines, which just refers to the vector displacement between the 2 antennas. And then this vector displacement gives us sensitivity to different modes on the sky. So a source that's emitting radio waves on the sky is going to be picked up in this correlation based on its intensity and its position on the sky. And then if we have a lot of these different correlated measurements, we can reconstruct a pretty good map of what's actually going on in the sky. All right, so this brings me to kind of the core of my work, which is how do we achieve EOR science and what does this have to do with calibration? So foreground contamination is a major challenge for EOR science. And when I say foregrounds, I mean just everything that is between us and the EOR signal. So this is radio emission from our own galaxy and also from other extragalactic galaxies. So the foregrounds are emitting at a rest frame wavelength that is longer than 21 centimeters because they're close by. And the source of emission is predominantly galactic synchrotron emission. And the key point here is that foreground emission is 4 to 5 orders of magnitude brighter than the EOR signal. So just absolutely swamps what we're looking for. And this makes it such a formidable challenge for us. So this is just an image of the sky that came out of the GLEAM collaboration, which is part of the MWA collaboration, just showing kind of what the radio sky looks like at our frequencies in the low frequency radio. And you can see that the galaxy itself, the galactic plane, is just extremely bright. You see all of these lobes coming off of the galaxy, and then you also see tons and tons of other sources. All right, so what do we do to mitigate these foregrounds? Why do we think that EOR science is even possible? Well, first of all, we measure dark fields on the sky. That's easy. But of course, foreground emission is still dominating by many, many orders of magnitude. So we're not going to look directly at, the galactic plane, but we still need to contend with foregrounds. But the key point is that foreground emission is spectrally smooth, and this is not what we expect from the EOR signal. And so what we do is we filter it out based on its spectral properties. However, this requires that the instrument itself does not introduce spectral structure. So once the instrument is introducing its own spectral structure, if we don't understand that fully and don't mitigate it fully, it's going to introduce that structure into the foregrounds and make them impossible to differentiate from the EOR signal. We have a really complicated instrumental bandpass response. So this is just a characteristic MWA bandpass, just showing all of the lovely features we have here. So kind of highlighted in green, this is just supposed to be showing the coarse shape of the bandpass over the full frequency range that we're interested in. Shown in purple here is a large scale ripple, and we expect that this is coming from a cable reflection. So anywhere that we have a cable in the whole signal pipeline, if that has mismatched impedances, that is going to reflect the signal with some frequency that corresponds to the cable length. And so we see this all the time, that we're getting these ripples in our response because of cable reflections. This red line here is denoting a digital gain jump. So this is a quantization effect in the digitizer. So there's a bit selection that is not happening optimally, and this gives us a discontinuity in our frequency response. Then in blue here, we also have regular flagging. We have aliasing these are called the coarse band edges, and they come from the PFB, or the polyphase filter, in the analog signal path. It causes aliasing, and we have to remove that. So just all of these features give us an intrinsic bandpass response that is very not spectrally smooth. One thing I should note about this is that the HERA actually has a much better, and by better I mean smoother, frequency response, and that largely came out of the fact that it is a next generation array. It's still currently under construction, and it learned lessons from its predecessors. So the MWA is an earlier instrument. We didn't know how bad these systematics were going to be, and HERA has learned from essentially its mistakes. Okay, but regardless, for either instrument, bandpass calibration is key to enabling EOR measurements. So calibration refers to the process of measuring the instrumental response in situ, and this is important because the bandpass response is super sensitive to a lot of subtle features in the array. So for example, a reflection off of another dish or something in the environment, obviously the full signal path comes into play. And so we really need to do this measurement in situ. The bandpass must be measured extremely precisely in order to mitigate instrumental frequency structure. So because the foregrounds are so bright, we need to make sure we're measuring the bandpass to 1 part in 10 to the 5, essentially, in order to be able to remove it and get back our spectrally smooth foregrounds that can be removed. Calibration precision is currently a dominant limitation in 21 centimeter cosmology and EOR science in particular. So this is just a rough schematic of what calibration is actually doing. So the process of calibrating means taking the measured data and trying to fit it to simulated data. So we use a sky model as the input. We put it through a model of the instrument that has been parameterized with some tunable parameters, and that gives us our simulated data. And then we take those tunable parameters and we try to tune them to the optimal values that match the data. Generally, our tunable parameters are what we call a gain per antenna. So I should say per antenna, per frequency, and per time. The gain is a complex number, so it has an amplitude that corresponds to the sensitivity of the antenna, and then it also has a phase that has to do with the timing of the antenna. So my first branch of work that is trying to improve precision calibration is improving the calibration sky model. So going back, it's actually working on this part and trying to get that input better so that everything downstream of it will work better. So this here is a power spectrum of the model that we use in calibration. So on the left-hand side, we have large modes on the sky. On the right-hand side, we have small modes on the sky. And then the vertical axis is just the power on those modes. The red line here is a typical calibration model that we use. And our standard models are compact models, meaning that they are point sources and things that are slightly resolved, so a little bit bigger than point sources. The dashed black line here is our actual data, and you can see that there's a clear discrepancy between our model and the data at large modes on the sky. I call this the diffuse lump sometimes, and it just represents the fact that our calibration model does not have diffuse emission in it. The way that we deal with this is we simply don't calibrate on baselines that measure those large scales. So we exclude all of our short baselines that are sensitive to large scales on the sky from calibration, and then we only calibrate to our long baselines. And this introduces some problems. First of all, it limits our calibration signal to noise. It doesn't work well for compact arrays. Compact arrays don't have a lot of long baselines. They're dominated by short baselines. And this is bad for them. And it also produces worse spectral calibration errors. And I'm not going to go into detail about why that is in this talk, but I'm happy to talk about it after if people are interested. So I've been working on trying to fix this. So my recent work is actually mapping diffuse emission with the MWA. And it turns out that this emission is highly polarized. And so this has to be a fully polarized map. And this is the result of my work. The 4 different images you see here are the 4 Stokes polarization modes. We see considerable structure in Stokes Q and U in the linear polarization modes. We do not see a lot of structure in Stokes V, and we don't expect any structure in Stokes V. We expect it to be noise-like. So any of the features you see in Stokes V are imaging artifacts, and we don't expect that they are real. So just a little bit about this map. It's produced with data from the MWA. It consists of 174 2-minute observations that are pieced together, mosaic together to cover the whole field. It covers diffuse emission of about 1 to 10 degrees on the sky. So these are very large scales. It covers a huge swath of the southern sky. Again, it's fully Stokes polarized. Compact sources have been deconvolved or removed from it, and it's at 182 megahertz, which is roughly at the center of our band for EOR science with the MWA. So this is just a map of the full sky. You can see the galaxy coming through, and the white rectangle is just a rough representation of where this map actually covers. So it's a very large area, and it covers most of the fields of interest for both the MWA and HERA. So a little bit about how we produce this. We use the FHD software pipeline, which is a data analysis pipeline developed at the University of Washington. We retrofitted it for full Stokes polarization as part of this project. So the basic process for how we image these observations is we calibrated them with long baselines only. Like I said before, we can't use short baselines if we don't have a good diffuse map. Then we deconvolved point sources, over 10,000 of them per 2-minute observation. And then we re-imaged the observation with short baselines only. And this does two things. First, it highlights that diffuse emission that we really care about, and it also gives us a well-defined normalization. And then finally, we combined observations. We mosaicked them together to get the final map. So just a bit about the polarization process for this map. So the MWA, it's right in the name, Murchison Widefield Array. It's a very wide field instrument. And so a big part of this project was contending with wide field polarization projection effects. So on the right, this is just a representation of the polarization modes that are measured by a simple dipole antenna configuration. And you can see that as you move towards the horizon, as you move away from zenith, it measures very non-orthogonal polarization modes. And so this was something that we had to fully model for the MWA and reconstruct correctly. We also had to correct for polarization errors from errors in the polarized beam model. And so on the right here, this is plotting polarization leakage. So in particular here, this is I to Q leakage for different point sources that we measured. Then we took that measured polarization leakage and fit a surface to it, which you can see in the back here. So this is a second degree polynomial surface. And we use this to model errors in the beam model and correct for them. And we also had to correct for ionospheric Faraday rotation. We're extremely sensitive to the ionosphere, and it's also very time dependent. And so we needed to model and correct for that. So again, these are the resulting maps. And we can take these and propagate them through our analysis pipeline. So going back to this power spectrum plot, we can see the effect of now including that diffuse emission here. So this orange line, orange yellow line, is just the diffuse model itself. And then the blue line is the combination of that compact source catalog along with our diffuse model. And you can see that it's representing the data a lot better now. All right, so that kind of concludes my work developing the calibration sky model. Now I'm going to talk about advanced calibration techniques. So to talk about this, I need to talk about the two primary calibration methods that are well established in the field right now. First of all, we have sky-based calibration. This one is pretty straightforward, matching data to a sky model. It works best for non-regular arrays. And by non-regular arrays, I just mean those pseudo-random arrays or arrays that are not kind of regular grids of antennas on the ground. Then the alternative to sky-based calibration is called redundant calibration. Redundant calibration only works for regular arrays, and it calibrates by matching repeated baseline measurements. And I'll note that the bulk array response still has to be constrained by a sky model. And so there's, in no sense does redundant calibration eliminate the need for a sky model. And actually some of my previous work showed that redundant calibration is actually very sensitive to errors in the sky model, much like sky-based calibration is. So just to be a little bit more clear, redundant calibration works for these regular arrays where you have multiple repeated baselines. And these repeated baselines are measuring the same modes on the sky. So we expect them to get the same number out, and it calibrates by constraining those values to be similar. Yeah, so as you can see for a regular array, you can draw many different sets of redundant baselines. So just looking at the actual array layouts of the two projects I work on, HERA is a fully redundant array. It consists of this offset hexagon. So it's a hexagon, but it's been kind of divided up into 3 different sections. So there's 300 antennas when complete, I should say. It's not been fully built out. There will be 300 antennas in this close packed hexagon, and then there's also an extra 50 outrigger antennas that give us longer baselines. The MWA, we call it a hybrid array because it has both redundant and non-redundant components. So it has this pseudo-random core and other antennas. And then with the phase 2 upgrade, we added these 2 hexagonal subarrays. And the hexes are fully redundantly calibratable. The rest of the array is not. So that is also an interesting problem, figuring out how to optimally calibrate it with these 2 different array types. All right, so some of my recent work is developing a new approach to calibration that we call unified calibration. So unified calibration represents an intermediate approach that is between sky-based and redundant calibration. It's based on a Bayesian statistical framework, and it uses a sky model as a prior on the redundant baseline measurements. So when I say that it works in an intermediate regime between sky-based and redundant calibration is fully leveraging those redundant measurements and constraining based on that everything that can be constrained. And then sky-based calibration is not using redundancy information at all. And in unified calibration, we have a physically motivated model for the error on each of those. And we use that to use the sky model somewhat and then also leverage that redundancy information. All right, and we simulated the result of unified calibration. So for simplicity, we used just a super simple array of 36 circular aperture antennas in a close pack configuration. We assumed perfect redundancy, which just means that we didn't model any errors in the antenna positions, and we assumed that they all had identical responses to the sky. We simulated visibilities from the Gleam catalog, which is just the catalog that we typically use to calibrate with, and we injected Gaussian thermal noise. And then to make this a more physical simulation, we also included error on our sky model. And we simulated sky model errors by just excluding some of the sources in the Gleam catalog. And so we only simulated sources that were brighter than 100 millijanskis. And this is just representing the fact that our sky model is always missing some sources. We always have kind of a completeness threshold on the flux densities that we represent in it. And so this is well represented by just dropping faint sources from the model. And these missing sources introduce errors into the model. So plotted on the right here are just errors in the sky model with these X's here. So the white plus sign is the 0 point, and then all of these real and imaginary errors on the model visibilities are denoted here. The black circle is just the standard deviation of those errors, and then the blue dotted circle is the standard deviation of the thermal noise that we injected. And then we tried calibrating this with 3 different calibration approaches. So on the left is kind of classic redundant calibration. On the right is classic sky-based calibration. And in the middle is our new work using unified calibration. So in simulation, we know what the true gains should be. They should all be 1 identically, and that's labeled on each of the plots with the white plus sign. And then deviations from 1 represent errors in calibration. So you can see that each redundant calibration and sky-based calibration have some offset from the 0 error position, and they also have larger distributions than unified calibration, whereas unified calibration is well-centered and has a slightly more compact distribution. This is preliminary work, but it really points to the fact that unified calibration is doing something right and could potentially mitigate calibration error. All right, and with that, I'm going to transition a little bit and talk about using cloud computing to enable this work. So 21 centimeter cosmology requires massive data sets. I think this is the same for all branches of radio astronomy, but 21 centimeter cosmology in particular requires these long data integrations and just enormous petabyte level data archives. Cloud computing offers tools for managing all of this data and gives us really flexible high performance computing. We specifically use the Amazon Web Services or AWS cloud computing platform. And we perform our analysis with virtual servers, which we call instances. So cloud computing is really interesting because it operates with a pay for what you use model, where costs are given in instance hours of runtime. So this is just a representation of our cloud workflow, and this was pulled from a recent paper that we came out with, kind of describing these techniques. So EC2 is the computation branch of AWS, and then S3 is the data storage branch. And basically what this is showing is that we use an AMI, or an Amazon Machine Image is what that stands for. So we have an image that we can just impose on all of our instances to get all of our software kind of immediately installed on those. And then we do our computation in this scaling virtual cluster in the cloud. So also as part of this recent paper, we explored the effects of using the spot market. So the spot market, or spot instances, is a service provided by AWS that substantially discounts your computation if you are okay with your instances being reclaimed at any moment. So it's basically if you request spot instances instead of on-demand instances, is what they call them, not spot instances, you can get kind of excess unused compute power for cheap. And this is something that we've taken advantage of, sometimes with great savings, and it is awesome, and sometimes it is not so great if they're shut down really frequently. And so in this paper, we did a little Monte Carlo simulation of this to show when using spot instances is actually going to be in your best interest. So on the left here is just the total processing cost for different spot termination rates. And we simulated just 100 kind of typical processing jobs. And you can see that in black here is just the on-demand cost. So this is the cost not using spot instances, and your costs increase when you're using spot instances if they terminate a lot, just because you're going to have to rerun things. And you can mitigate this effect if your code has a lot of checkpointing in it. So if you fully save your code state, you don't have to rerun as much. Spot terminations also substantially increase your processing time. So one of the major advantages of using the cloud is that it is very, very scalable, and you can get large parallelized runs done very quickly, but this is going to be slower if you have a lot of spot terminations. All right, so I think cloud computing with AWS really falls into pros and cons trade-off. So I'm not going to say cloud computing is the best thing ever and everyone should do it. I'm going to say cloud computing is an extremely powerful tool. It can be very useful. And if you're interested in it, you should really consider how it relates to your research questions, how its pros and cons are going to affect the type of computation that you have to do in your labs. So on the pros side, it is nearly infinitely scalable. There are just incredible amounts of resources if you are willing to pay for them. It's extremely flexible. So you can run essentially any kind of computation. It has GPUs, it has CPUs. Yeah, it's kind of fully customizable. It is super reliable. So I think academic computing clusters is more of a your mileage may vary kind of thing, where some of them are really excellent, but we've also seen, a number of our collaborators have problems with the reliability of their academic computing clusters, and AWS will not go down. I mean, the internet runs on AWS essentially, so it's extremely, extremely reliable. There are a lot of grant opportunities for academic researchers, and this is something we've absolutely taken advantage of. We've gotten a lot of grants from AWS and from other sources to do cloud computing. And then this pay-per-use model can actually save you a lot of money in the long run if you're doing a type of computation where you have a lot of downtime between runs. This can be really beneficial. So some of the cons of cloud computing is it can be hard to get started. The documentation can be pretty thin, and it usually is written to a DevOps audience. which I am not. And so it is not always accessible to academic researchers. The cost can be difficult to predict and to control. And then I'm going to put pay for use on both the pros and the cons side, because again, depending on the type of computation you're doing, this can not lead to so many cost savings. Yeah, and with that, I'll just leave off with some acknowledgements to my group members, to my collaborators, to the seminar series for hosting me, and a couple more photos of my collaborators. On the bottom here, this is us assembling MWA dipoles on site. And I will take questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Ruby. All right, if folks have questions, you could post them in the Zoom chat or even just, I don't know, speak up. Yes.
Yeah, I actually had a question on the Amazon service stuff. What have you found the user interface to be like for that? Like graduate student, regular first-year grad students can figure it out pretty easily, or the documentation is so thin it takes a lot of time to get that sorted?
I would say regular first-year graduate students can be trained on it. So it definitely requires some training, but that's something that we do. I mean, we do, the majority of our computation on the cloud right now. And so I've trained a number of grad students in how to use it. The interface is a combination of command line tools, and then there's also a browser-based console that you use, which is actually pretty non-intuitive. I think I have an easier time training people to use the command line interface. But it's, once we have it established and running, I think it's pretty simple to train people on. So just if I go back a little bit, if I can go back to this, kind of when I say that it's up and running, it means that I've developed the AMI. And so I can just sort of give that to another researcher, and if they know how to boot up their own cloud-based cluster, they just install the AMI and it's ready to go for them.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Cool, so I have a question. Now you said there's like roughly petabytes of data that this is being processed. Yeah. Does the data get stored in S3 like all the time, or are you, I don't know, keeping it there so you can run the processing in AWS, and then like presumably that costs money to keep data there all the time. So I don't know if you're like storing it locally too, or what the.
Yeah. So when I say petabytes, the MWA Cosmology program has 2 petabytes of data in archive right now. That is not archived on AWS, so that's archived in a supercomputing center in Australia. We have significant many terabytes of data on S3 right now, and that's divided up into 2 types of storage. So again, as part of the grants program where they're really encouraging academic researchers to use AWS, we have developed a program with them where we can store raw data for free, as long as it is public.
Oh, cool. So
yeah, we're completely happy having our data be public, and so that's worked out really well for us. I don't really imagine that the general public has a lot of interest in raw MWA data that has not been calibrated or imaged, but that's what we worked out with them. And then the data products are stored in an S3 bucket that we do have to pay for. And so that is, a significant investment in our AWS costs is maintaining that. And we do, try to be a little frugal about that, which is a different way of thinking than I think I've had to in the past, where kind of you put some data on a disk and forget about it. When you're getting a monthly bill for it, you need to think a little differently.
Yeah, cool, thanks.
And there's also, AWS has a lot of different storage classes. And so we've we do deep storage for some of our data products, which is super cheap,
Right,
but
glacier or something. It's the
yeah.
We have other questions?
I have another one if no one else has any questions. Okay. In the unified calibration work, so you simulated an antenna array that's not either MWA or HERA. I imagine you're thinking the next step is a simulation of one of those arrays, or sort of or you tell me, what's your next step on that?
Yeah, I would love to get some more physical arrays simulated. I think the next step for me is in the simulation I showed, we were assuming perfect redundancy, and another implication of the unified calibration framework is that you can relax that assumption, and you can actually put in a physical model of what the redundancy is, where you can say that two baselines are kind of mostly redundant, but maybe correlated to 95% or something like that. You expect those measurements to have a correlation, but not be exactly equal. So that's really the next avenue that I'm interested in exploring, is looking at, if you perturb the positions of the antennas, if they have irregular beam responses, how can you take that non-redundancy and really incorporate it into your calibration model to more robustly fit out those differences between measurements.
And is there a clear way to introduce crosstalk? I ask, apropos of nothing.
No,
Okay.
there's not right now. That'd be really interesting. I mean, in a sense, crosstalk is degrading the array's redundancy. And so you could statistically include it in that sense. But in terms of like injecting a signal from another antenna, I don't know of a way to do that.
Thanks.
All right, so I have another question too, if you want to keep on. Can we back up to the polarization calibration part?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you say more about the sort of modeling you have to do for the interaction with the ionosphere? That sounds difficult.
Sure, yeah. So we model the ionospheric Faraday rotation as a rotation measure per observation. So we assume that it is constant over a 2-minute observation and over the field of view, which is really different than some other arrays. So for example, LOFAR in the Netherlands is a much larger array, and so they expect that their longest baselines of the antennas are propagating through very different parts of the ionosphere, and that requires them to do more complicated modeling. We expect that the MWA is compact enough that we can say it's kind of the same ionospheric depth for every antenna that it's propagating through. So we just use a single rotation measure per observation. And we calculated the rotation measure in 2 different ways. So we used a package called RM extract first, which actually came out of the LOFAR collaboration. They've done a lot of excellent work with the ionosphere. And so that gave us an estimate of the RM for each observation. And then we also did sort of a self-cal step after that, where we then took observations of an overlapping field and said, is there a correction we can make to the RM? So small adjustment to make those different overlapping observations agree better. So that's kind of a delta on the rotation measure. And then when we actually correct for the rotation measure, the correction is just a rotation of the polarization mode, and then also a correction for the amplitude, what's the word I'm looking for? Decoherence over the frequency range.
Cool.
Does
Thanks.
that answer your question?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I just did a bunch of polarization calibration for CMB stuff. It's just interesting to hear about the different systematics you can get here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think if you go deep into the ionosphere, there's a lot more sophisticated stuff you can do. We were making a lot of simplifying assumptions by just saying we've got one ionospheric depth per observation.